the demand is super high. Why is the demand high? Two big reasons. There's actually a third reason, but I'll put it as a kind of an aside. So go ahead.
People now have purchasing power.
Okay, they have purchasing power. Basically, post World War I, the U.S. has more stuff to buy. And stuff, by the way, is not an official word, but we can go with it. More stuff to buy. What's the other reason?
They didn't spend any money during the war.
Ah, that's this part here. During the war, very little spending because they couldn't. All the resources are devoted to the war. So the accounts are actually high. As soon as it's done, they've got all these new things, toasters, appliances, cars, whatever, you're buying it.
And also, like you said about like how products before the war, like before the consumer culture, they would like last forever.
Yes,
And now
yes.
new products
Well, we're getting to that. There's a third part here, though. This is domestic. Where's the other cause for a very high demand for our economy? You what?
Export.
Export for what purpose? What was also creating a big demand for American products?
Whatever was destroyed in the World War.
Reconstruction after World War I. Absolutely. Now, not every supply came from the United States, but man, we are producing things and selling them as quickly as we can to France. Because that's where the war happened. And so we are rebuilding Europe. Go ahead.
So the reconstruction that was happening, like in France, like what you're mentioning right
Yes.
now, is that like what happened after our the Civil War?
Very much the same. Just like we had physical destruction, we have to reconstruct it. But when we say reconstruction in the United States, we have two meanings for it. One of them is physically rebuilding the tracks we blew up, rebuilding the factories, that type of stuff. There weren't a lot of factories in the South. But rebuilding the infrastructure, yes. The other part of Reconstruction, which is what most people think, is reconstructing the Union. The fact that we're a country and we don't want these 11 states that had seceded to be separate nations. So they need to be brought back in. And how can we do it in such a way that they don't want to go off and create another civil war?
So is this reconstruction like the physical?
No, it's mainly infrastructure. Yeah, it's mainly the infrastructure. They're not part of us. We don't have to worry about them politically. Not so much. We will a little bit later, but not so much. It's totally in terms of infrastructure. And the reason why this is important is that all three of these things create a huge demand. And then Teja, who left the room right now, indicated what's wrong with this roaring 20s. This will create a boom in the 1920s. But what's the drawback?
Never have to buy it again.
This is really the first, you have to understand, it's really the first time we had a consumer society. Consumer society means that you buy most of your stuff instead of making your stuff. We started this in the 1870s, right at the beginning of industrialization, but it doesn't really come to full fruition until after World War I. Because not only are we a consumer society, but we are a largely urban society. You know, you don't have a backyard where you can grow corn. So everything you eat and consume has to be purchased. It's a consumer society. Now, in the good news, this consumer society is largely what's pushing the demand. But what's the bad news? How many toasters do you need? How many appliances? How many stoves? How many washing machines? And they really did build them to last. Because you're selling it. It's the first time. You know now they don't build these things to last. Deliberately they don't build it to last. Plastic was like a godsend to the economy. Why is that? It breaks. It's cheap to make and it breaks. Fantastic. Your phone, you got it 2 years ago. And you guys know this. If you have a 3-year-old phone, what do we call it? An antique, right? My little smartphone, I don't have it with me. My smartphone, I think, is 5 years old. I pull it out, people laugh at me. Now, when I bought this, everybody had this phone. But now it's a kind of a joke. I love it. And unfortunately, you can't buy them anymore because it's not only antique, it's before all the little tools. It's before all the little tools on it that know where you are at every moment. It's before all the tools that can kind of find your habits and take some of that information and sell them to all the other companies. They don't want me to have that phone. And yet I love the phone. It never breaks. The economy does change, but that's because we have experience. We have history. We know how to do things like that now. Not then. Then you're going to build a toaster. It'll last forever. That washing machine will last forever. So we have a problem because what happens to the demand? It's a natural occurrence. What happens when we bought everything? It's going to go down. What happens when we've reconstructed Europe? The demand is going to go down. This isn't a scandal where some rich guy is responsible for the Great Depression. It's just a natural phenomenon. The difference here, and the reason why the Depression is so notable now, is that it occurred when we are a consumer society. We have had economic downturns numerous times. After Andrew Jackson killed the National Bank, 1837, it took a while, about 5 years, the economy was in shambles. But where did everybody live in 1837, for the most part? Out on a farm. You don't have any money? Doesn't matter. You're growing most of your food anyway. You just can't buy more stuff. Remember 1893, when the banks all collapsed after the railroad industry went bankrupt? Who was affected most? The farmers. Did that mean they were starving? No, it just means that their loans were pulled. They still were buying and growing whatever they needed out on the farm. In this recession, most of the people are living in an urban center. When the economy tanks and unemployment goes up, they have no money to buy what they need. So the fear of starving, actually starving, is very real. Now, I say that, but please, 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 please. We say this to emphasize the fact that an urban society is different from an agricultural society. Please, when you write your essays, do not write, in the Great Depression, people were starving in the streets. I use that phrase because I cannot tell you how many times students have written that down. Starving in the streets. Just pause for a second. It's very descriptive and very graphic. So I'm walking down the street. Yeah, there's somebody starving. Wish I could do something. Nah, I'd be dead tomorrow. I'll come back. Walking. Oh, there's another dead body. Whoa, just hop over that. This is not what the Great Depression was like. There's reasons why we create this kind of mythos of the Great Depression. I'll talk about that later. But that's not what it was. The Great Depression was a huge economic downturn. But at its worst, 25% unemployment in certain locations. Mostly urban. And that's really hard. Except what? You math majors, what does that mean?
75%.
It means you have 75% employment. And what if you're not in those urban areas? You talk to your great-grandparents who were living in this region, and you ask them what it was like in the Great Depression. They'll say, yeah, it was hard. In our house, we had like 1, 2 dresses. We didn't have any games as kids. Most of our games are like little toys. You know, I said, what's in your closet? You open up the closet, there's nothing in there, right? I mean, you could put just a few things. I open up my children's closet, it is just filled with crap. I'm sorry, treasures that are savored with some great sentimentality. It's just tons of stuff. In the 30s, you didn't have much stuff. But were they starving? You asked them, were you starving? No. We're in a farm. This is Wisconsin. I've got the trees, maple trees for the maple syrup, for my sugar. I've got the corn to feed my pigs. Pigs give me the bacon. I've got chickens for the eggs. I've got the dairy. I've got the milk, beef. I'm not starving. I just don't have cash. Wisconsin, not hurt so much in the Great Depression. What about Chicago?
Because they have to buy it.
That's right. It's urban. But does that mean people are starving in the streets? Now pause for a second. Let's say you are walking down Chicago and there's somebody actually starving, ready to die. Are you just going to look at him and then walk by?
You'd be surprised.
No. I don't know. I might. It depends on how I'm doing. Oh, well, somebody will take care of them. No, the good news is that mostly urban areas, right, they're the hardest hit. And yet, what's the advantage of an urban area? also have the most resources. So what happens almost immediately? And you guys know this because you know the phrase, even though we don't really have them very much anymore. What's a soup kitchen? We can go for food. Immediately people do this. That's why we don't have people starving in the street. Do you have people that are very, very poor? Yes. Are they starving in the streets? This is why I'm trying to make this point. Soup kitchens, for the most part, are when personal folks, usually churches, they were the first, right on the back, because they had soup kitchens in the 1850s. They had soup kitchens in the 1750s. If you're starving, you go to the church. They'll give you something, right? That's where the concept, charity. Well, in big, giant Chicago, maybe the church can't do anything, but we're in a society that really believes in progressivism, right? And progressivism means that if we have a social problem, we find some expert, and then they solve it. And usually when they solve it, they might use some government resources to do it. The soup kitchens are being overwhelmed, so what do? Chicago says, we will devote some of our tax money to create a shelter so that these guys can be paid. Well, that's good on the local level. What about if you're not in a city? Well, the farmers aren't as hit, but it doesn't mean that people aren't hungry. What if the city doesn't have enough money to do this? Who are they going to ask for help from? The state. What if the state doesn't have much money? So we go back to this definition of reform. For Coolidge and for Hoover, the definition of reform was restraint. As soon as the economy began to go down, what did many of these former progressives begin demanding? Action. Give us money. Give us some way of solving this. So, 1932.